It's time to live life through the eyes of fit people so that you too can live a fit life yourself. This is Fit Because. I'm one of your hosts, Jennifer Zerling, but you can call me Jay-Z. I'm a fitness and age management expert, author, speaker, as well as an international health advocate.
And I'm your other host, George Veater. I'm an entrepreneur, cattle rancher, fitness enthusiast, and a 6-time rodeo champion who has a huge amount of knowledge to share with you in the area of self-improvement.
Oh, he does. Get ready to learn how to bridge the gap between knowing what to do and doing what it takes to become physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and financially fit.
You ready, Jay-Z?
Oh, I'm ready, George. Let's dive in. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Fit Because show. I'm here in studio with George Veater. I am your co-host, Jay-Z, and we have a guest today for this, 25th episode already?
It is.
And it is going to be one fabulous episode because we are having Torin Hill on our show to talk about stress, panic, and fear and what happens to us when we're in crisis mode. I mean, oh my gosh, something that we really need to know, because if we're not able to navigate through crisis, then we can never be fit.
Yeah.
Because we'll be dead. So this guy is great to have on the show. And I'm just so excited to have you, Torin. Welcome to Fit Because. Let's dive in and talk about who you are and how you got into this line of work.
So I got started in the realm of combatives years ago, back in 1994. And combatives is basically how to teach the first 6 months of pretty much all martial arts in less than 6 weeks. So we have a military history here in America dating back to the, at least the Second World War of a combatives methodology. Israel has one called Krav Maga, most people are familiar with. Most countries have a combatives program. Russia has Sambo. Everyone has something. And they usually take an amalgam of a bunch of different martial arts and then try to figure out a way to teach them as fast as possible. So it's kind of the problem is you need to teach young, stubborn students how to survive violent encounters in an absolute minimum of time. And so the interest isn't necessarily progressing into belts and personal development and everything else. It's mostly just getting people ready to go out there and get in harm's way. So that's kind of how I got started a long time ago now, almost 25 years now. And part of what's always missing in that is that there's a disconnect between training and the actual massive panic-driven experience of applying what it is that you've learned. And that's true in the battlefield and the boardroom. Is the level of stress that you experience is more than you're prepared for. And so people are constantly trying to overcome these levels of stress. So the common argument that most people have that when I was coming up was the argument that you just do more practice, or the idea that perfect practice makes perfect. And if that were true, then you would only be prepared for what you've practiced. And the problem is that they don't really account for the time constraints of unit-based training, which is what we were kind of looking at. It also doesn't account for highly trained, competition-tested people who still fail to do their actual practice in the face of a real threat. So there's always some form of disconnect that's going on. So one of the things I got involved with was the research into stress and choking. I thought it would be relevant. But most stress-based performance research, like Odejan in 2009, is based on really low stress levels. And so most of the stuff that's out there about choking and whatnot is based on people taking math tests or standing on ladders. And so they don't really, when you read them, they don't really extrapolate. They're not really relevant to a much larger stress level. And in the early 90s, the neuro research established that there's a threshold in the brain with perceived threat, and working below the threshold just simply doesn't prepare you for what's above it. At a certain point in time, you have to actually go to the other side of the sufficient threat. And so the disconnect for us was that when you take the danger out of a critical incident, so you can train it, that you're really not prepared for when you put yourself back into a dangerous environment, especially as a surprise. So for me personally, I kind of decided that I would create a place where clients or subjects would not only confront real panic-inducing threats, but they've also are able to execute the training they've done in a similar panic recall situation. And that's really been my focus. I ended up creating a testing ground for the transformational effects of panic, stress, and fear on high-level individuals. Sometimes jokingly referred to as the most exclusive supper club, because you have to die 4 or 5 times before you can get in. And so that's really what got me started here, was trying to create this environment where people could go experience what it's like to deal with real valid threat safely, and not run the risk of dying while experiencing what it's like to nearly die. So
wow,
that would give me nightmares.
That's a lot to absorb. Yeah,
right?
Wow. No, that's awesome. Ooh. So, can you tell us, Torin, what in your life, got you into this? So, what's your personal background?
Aside from growing up in the 70s and 80s, and things were a lot less supervised back then, especially with hippie parents. Things were a lot less supervised back then. Probably the major thing was living in San Diego got me into this. I was located close to Pendleton and Coronado and a number of other things. So there's my grandfather, who I grew up with, was a retired lieutenant colonel of the Air Force. So the military presence in my life was always really strong. And so that was kind of the thing that sort of, especially for my grandfather, that personality that comes through in sort of the sort of older generation was something that was really attractive to me, trying to figure out how to live my life according to that sort of ethos that my grandfather lived.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's great.
So what really, kind of brought me down this road was my interest in emotion in general, which is something that initially when I was doing this, it wasn't actually on my radar. I was mostly focused on sort of the mechanistic idea of fighting and danger and violence and all these different things. And what it ended up boiling down to is how people handle stress, fear, panic, emotion, and how they end up getting into this idea of learned helplessness versus self-mastery, and how people develop that ability to have some sort of stress resiliency. That's the stuff that's really ended up fascinating me over the past 15, 20 years.
So who do you think needs your services? Because, I mean, obviously I could talk from example. I was in New York City during 9/11, but the higher powers brought me uptown that day instead of on Wall Street, where I used to personal train right on Wall Street for all those folks. And I also had another scenario off the top of my head, which was pretty traumatic, where I was in Grand Central Terminal in the ladies' room, and a guy was in the stall next to me watching me use the bathroom. And luckily for me, he ran out. And I rewind. I'm like, well, what if he trapped me in that bathroom stall? Would I have known what to do? Probably not. So, I mean, obviously, when I ask that question, who needs your services, you're probably going to tell me everyone. But what would that look like for someone like me on how to handle stuff like that?
So there's kind of I would say there's two separate things to that. One, I would say that most people don't need my services, that most people need services kind of before they get to me. That we're kind of, that project that I work on is a bit more of a sort of a finishing school, if you will, and that there's a basic level of self-defense training that people should undergo. And most of it is going to be focused on awareness and, situational awareness, especially, and, personal development, things of that nature. And so I would recommend most people go seek that out. There's thousands, hundreds of thousands of people teaching that around the world. And there's a lot of qualified instruction out there for that. However, there's the other factor that you also described, and that's something that I focus on, which is how you deal with the surprise emotion that comes with that. Because 9/11 notwithstanding, that's a bigger, that's a much larger and longer sort of temporally bigger idea of how to deal with the trauma of that and the sort of long-term sort of impact of an event like that. However, the bathroom stall experience probably is equally vivid, if not more so. And what you can think about is how you respond in that moment. What happened to your brain in that moment? That's really my focus. And for a lot of people, they've gone through, I've got probably more Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts that come back to me after years of training, that come back to me over and over again to continue to improve, because the level of stress that they deal with at the top, the level of competitive stress isn't enough to really help them refine the way their brain works, or people who consider themselves the top 1% in any sort of endeavor. Those people come to me because they're interested in really challenging themselves at kind of the next level. And how your brain worked in the bathroom stall is exactly the same way that most people's brains work under the presence of immediate threat. And that's really my focus is how to help people deal with the way your brain essentially breaks under immediate threat. Because it's really difficult to think, it's really difficult to operate, to get a clear sense of yourself and what you're capable of in that moment. So all the training can flee you when things are really stressful. Like that's true for pretty much everybody on the planet. It's not something that's unique to untrained people. It's something that's just universally true about the way our brains work, and to some degree also the way our emotions sort of take over, for lack of a better description. So I would say this might be more along your focus, really, sir. Would be something that you'd be interested in. I know that you do some rodeo and whatnot, amongst a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
And so this would be at that sort of top level of performance. How do you turn down the volume knob when the most stressful thing that you've ever experienced is the thing that you're about to go experience again?
Right.
And that's the hard part is how do you get prepared for a maximal experience? Yep. And that's really what I try to focus on.
Can you tell us, Torin, a little bit about what chemically happens to us? Is there an explanation, why that happens, why we can't use what we know in the moment we need to use it? So please,
it's incredibly frustrating as a human being. You're just like, all of this stuff that you've practiced is sitting in your brain, and you'd love to have access to it. But then on the flip side, it's like, well, right now, the time that you practiced for right now, we're not going to allow you to get into that safe. Yeah. And so you're just going to have to kind of fumble around with whatever you've got.
Right.
And then afterwards, like, well, now I can think, and now I can go do all the stuff that I knew how to do. It's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
So when I got back into this in 1994 in the combative space, the idea of autonomic responses was all the rage. So how people responded to stress and their release of endorphins and hormones and yada, yada, yada. Everyone was, adrenaline dump this and, hyper difficulty in gross motor movements of that. And I started trying to learn as much as I could at the time. And most of my days back then were pretty much spent either getting kicked or thrown around. And then I'd go and spend hours. I was by UCSD. I'd go and spend hours hanging out in the biomedical stacks at UCSD, either in the guys all over at the BLB. And I would just spend hours trying to learn as much as I could about what was happening with our bodies at the time. And one of the people that was doing really interesting research at the time was a guy in 94 by the name of Berntsen, who described the way that most of us think of the sympathetic and parasympathetic sort of ideas on a continuum. This idea that, you're either being activated at the sympathetic level or on the other side that you're calming down. So this sort of mobility and restive sort of idea. And Berntsen basically described this idea that there's actually a space. It's not a continuum. It's actually two axes. And so when you're thinking about excitement and rest, those are actually happening at some level at the same time. So there's always something that's working sort of in parallel with each other. And so you may have hyperactive and a little bit of rest at the same time, and sort of the parasympathetic and sympathetic are both being activated at the same time. And that same idea is true in our emotional state as well. It's not just in the release of hormones. It's essentially these two axes allow us to think of it as a space. So emotions aren't positive or negative on a continuum either. So frequently they should be kind of looked at as a space, using arousal and valence. Most people talk like, okay, how strong is your emotional experience, right? That's vertical. That would be the arousal. And then is it a positive or negative experience? And that would be your valence. But the problem is that that's not really how our brains work. It's not really just positive or negative either, because that also implies a continuum. So there's sort of a third dimension here, and that is that both positive and negative are happening at the same time. That there is a space of our emotional state based on sort of what part of our brains are working. So there's two parts of our brain. There's the aversive part of our brain called the amygdala, that most people kind of relate to the aversion. And then there's the appetitive or sort of reward-based part of our brain called the nucleus accumbens. And those both work at the same time in the same way that sympathetic and parasympathetic both work at the same time. There's a little thing called the ventral subiculum in your brain, and it gets to pick where or what piece of this is going to be hyperplastic in the process. What thing is going to be activated with long-term potentiation so that you can have a aversion or reward idea, but both of them are happening simultaneously. So things that are normally what most average people consider aversive can also be rewarding. So if you think of skydiving, right? The average person does not want to jump out of a plane, but the reward of jumping out of a plane for people who've done it before is tremendous. Getting on the back of a horse, right? Most people don't want to get thrown on their head. That's aversive. But there's a value to that, and that value is, and that reward that is actually happening is happening in parallel. So it's really easy to talk about positive and negative emotions when you can actually have a positive negative emotion.
Can you actually manipulate that through the work you do? And can you kind of guide us through what your work looks like when you manipulate it, if you can?
So that actually, we have kind of deep dive into what emotion is. And then I can kind of talk about what really I'm trying to get at to the process of our work.
Yeah, and dumb it down for our audience. Just keep it very, very, very simple, because I have a master's degree, and this stuff is getting a little too sciencey. It's giving me PTSD from my classes back in the day. All right.
So one of the researchers on the amygdala is a guy by the name of Joseph Ledoux, and he's pretty famous, and most people who do, are familiar with the amygdala are familiar with his name. He recently, last year, put out a paper with a philosopher by the name of Brown. And they basically talked about how emotions work. And they're not the way we all, for the most part, learned how emotions work. There's not an emotional seat at the back of your brain that actually makes you feel a certain way. Emotions don't happen low in the brain. Emotions are how you interpret what's happening inside your body. So what's called an interoception, or internal feeling, that sense of what's going on in your body. Can you feel your pulse? Are you breathing? Is your stomach upset or gurgling? All those different things are essentially interpreted by the front of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, into what would be described as an emotion. So we don't have fear coming from the back of our brain. We don't have happiness or anything coming from a little spot inside the brain. Those things contribute to the way that we interpret this in what's called an emotional schema, or kind of a structure that we build about our emotions. So by way of an example, if you remember the first time you fell in love, the first time you had heartache, the first time you were ever really depressed, any of those things, there's sort of that loss of words to communicate how you feel. And that sense of, I don't know how to describe this. And you tell someone, well, my stomach's upset and I'm sweating, and every time I see this person, I feel nervous and worried. They're like, oh, well, you're in love. Like, that's easy. You don't know. You're like, oh, well, so that's what this terrible experience is. It's love. So it's both negative and positive at the same time. And I want to do my best, but then I'm also worried about my performance. And so you have all of these big mix of things, but over time you kind of label it love, or you label it disappointment, or you label it, happiness, rejection, whatever you experience. You end up kind of making a sort of a group for it. You say, okay, this is going to go under that category. And then over each year, you kind of, every time you experience something, you go back to that memory of what that experience was like, and you refine that sort of experience. So that experience, all that processing happens at the front of your brain. It all happens at the prefrontal cortex. And so your ability to have emotions kind of by definition require you to have self-consciousness. They require you to be a thinking, feeling individual. Mm. And so below that point where you're actually able to interpret these things into emotion, below that, they're kind of described as survival circuits. There's things that are happening in your brain, and those things are informing the front of your brain how to interpret what you're experiencing. So
can we manipulate that, though? Can you manipulate that at all? Like if people in crisis situation?
Yeah, a couple different ways. One of the ways you can manipulate, the classic example of this is when people say, well, it's all based upon your outlook, right? How you interpret things. And it's absolutely true.
You always say that, George.
Your outlook absolutely defines your emotional schema. At some level, even your emotional schema helps define your outlook. It kind of works the other way, which is as you build things up, you start to understand what you can do, what you're capable of And that understanding of self helps inform how you interpret, George, I'm sure if you felt nervous about a performance or felt nervous about giving a talk in the past, knowing that you've done it before that, having that level of that sense of controllability helps alleviate some of that stress. Whereas for most people, not having done it in the past means that they can't control that level of stress. Yeah. And so how you interpret this, what's called a higher order representation of a representation of the survival circuit firing, is how we actually experience emotions. So it doesn't really have this little brain place that it all happens. The problem is under really extreme stress, at a high enough level, your prefrontal cortex essentially doesn't work very well. And so your ability to understand what emotional experiences you're having are put off until such time as you can actually think about what happened in the past. So you essentially puts that stuff on the back burner. And the only thing that happens is you respond without an emotional schema, and you respond in a situation where you don't really know what you can do because you've never been there before. So there's three things that really kind of govern that. If the experience or the presence of a perceived threat or the anxiety of the threat is totally novel, it's something completely new to you, it's incredibly complex, you don't know how to tackle it, or it's just too intense. So any one of those three things are contributing to your inability to really process or think about how to take on this threat, and it removes your ability to think clearly. And so when you lose that ability to think clearly, you're stuck with pretty much whatever you've either done in the past, or hopefully you've got the luck to fire off the correct thing and do the right thing for the time. Can't really be sure of that until after you've done it. And that's the part where it feels like you lose control. And so the biggest things about this is that you need to establish some sort of sense of controllability. If you can exert control over high level threat, and there's four things that go into it. It's your sense of controllability. It's whether or not the things are predictable, whether or not you know they're coming, whether they're avoidable, meaning if you can run, you take that opportunity, or escapable if you can run, or if they're avoidable, meaning you don't need to go and encounter them. The biggest one out of all of those is controllability. And so part of what I focus on is giving people a sense of controllability of extreme stress. We give them an experience where they do the largest scale threat that their brain can process. And then they are able to exert this ability to control that threat. And then in the process, when they encounter additional threats in the future, they're able to exert that level of controllability, reduce the level of stress, and essentially install a volume knob and turn down the volume on really stressful things. And so when you are able to jump out of a plane or get shot at and continue working without a problem, when those things happen, low-level stress that would normally be very tough for people, those things all get turned down. Right? Like after a rodeo, after a skydiving, whatever it may be, the little things are not terribly stressful. And so for what we're trying to do is we're trying to give people this self-mastery through this exposure to incredibly high-level threat that's safe. We give them this kind of expanded self-mastery that they then take off into the rest of their lives. And so the biggest thing that you can do is for yourself to kind of gain control of your emotions is to try to live at the sort of outside edge of where your emotions are by choice, so that you have some sense of controllability, not by surprise, where you're getting attacked constantly. That's not terribly beneficial.
Wow, it does make sense. I totally relate to that, especially in the rodeo business, because things happen so quick. And,
Right.
The longer you're in the business and you get to a certain level of mastery in riding bucking horses, everything slows down. Because in the beginning,
Yes.
it's just a blur. Everybody that started in the rodeo will tell you the first time the gate opened, they don't know what happened. They just can't process it. You're on your
Right.
head. You don't know how you got on your head. You can't remember anything about what happened between leaving the chute and being on your head, and then slowing it down and gaining awareness, and just calming down and reframing that moment. So that's what kept coming back to me as you're talking about this.
That experience is called perceptual distortion, or essentially tachychronia, like a change in the way you perceive time, or bradychronia, the way you perceive time. And that's really common under high stress situations. I've had reports from people, both in training, they experience that, which is really rare. People don't normally experience that in training. In our training, they do. But especially in the field, where under a threat, the guy comes to the door, he's got a knife, and people are like, oh yeah, I saw everything. Time slowed down. I knew exactly what to do. That is the ideal place to be in a response to a threat or some serious risk, as opposed to, I have no idea, it all happened so fast.
Right.
That's an absolute sense of no control. And that's sort of the difference there is how you perceive that threat will give you that sense of control and allow you to be like, oh, if I can make this small adjustment with my body or my grip, I can stay on here for an extra second. Or I know exactly what he's about to do.
Right.
I can feel it. And so you can actually think through these things logically. Whereas with enough stress, that whole process in your brain is gone.
I was going to say, I'm a lifestyle coach because, we're running out of time, and I want you to give a couple of great pointers. No, because you're just a wealth of knowledge. I love it. People stress all the time. Obviously, it's not life or death. So you're kind of making me feel like a lot of these people should just jump out of a plane and get a gun held to their head and then realize everything else is fine, right? Like, what do you suggest people do to lower their normal day-to-day stress? Do you have any suggestions for that?
Yeah, so that there's a description for what you described, and that's called post-traumatic growth. You mentioned PTSD earlier. The opposite side of that is post-traumatic growth. The fact that you can improve your life after a major, potentially negative experience, and that's entirely governed by outlook. How you perceive stress, how you respond to stress, and whether or not you can turn an absolute negative into an opportunity for growth, that's entirely based on your outlook. And it's both fate and state-based. So it's who you are as a person, and then also how you interpret that event in particular. So there's a lot of things that they can do. In general, me personally, I don't actually advocate for the average person to undergo a lot of stress. The average person, it's not beneficial, because most people really don't have a high stress resiliency threshold, because going from 0 to 120 is really risky for the average person. And so you can easily create a sense of helplessness very quickly in those states. So most of who I get are people who have a sense of this sense of self-mastery, but they know that there's the next level. For the other people, one of the best things you can possibly do is work on your breath control, work on your physical fitness, work on your ability to, improve your heart health. Those sorts of things, while they seem like they're unrelated, are actually massive contributors to stress resiliency. So your stress resiliency is outlook and cardiac health, heart rate variability, all these different things that go into helping to reduce that. Maybe go get a DNA test and check your cortisol sensitivity. Take a cortisol test, get some sort of biofeedback methodology. We do a lot of testing. We've got, I think, 59 different factors that we do in biometric and physical testing, psychometric and physical testing. But in general, the major things are, really working on yourself and improving your own health and fitness and your ability to respond to things as they show up on the radar.
No, that's awesome. So maybe what we're doing, Jay-Z, is we're helping people get to the point at which Torin can help them.
I feel like you work with military people, right? You work with people who actually sign up for these high levels of stress, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is, now publicly, for this program, it's exclusively nominations based now. So we basically only accept people who've been nominated to go through this.
Oh, wow.
So it's not, to the public in general anymore.
That is cool.
So,
well, Torin,
in the past, it's been a lot of special operations people, a lot of military, law enforcement, and then top tier athletes as well.
Yeah,
we've had a number of professional fighters and football people. A couple of different guys come through in an effort to really get a sense of what they're capable of and really challenge themselves.
I have a brother who's a cop, and those guys are on the street every single day, putting their life at risk and bringing their stress levels to levels that people will never experience in their lives. So next time you see someone in law enforcement or someone in the military, just thank them for their services and, recognize what they do is not easy. So
yeah, the level of stress for first responders is absolutely through the roof. The burnout for first responder careers is incredibly high. Healthcare professionals have a 16 times higher rate of assault on the job than any other service career. It's just amazing what people undergo as first responders, and that they do it to help the community is truly heroism.
Well, Torin, thank you for being a guest on this show, and thank you for the work that you do. I mean, what an interesting and valuable passion to put forth into the world for those people that, I mean, it's going to save their life and save the lives of others to be able to manage stress and perform under stress and understand the psychology of that and gain the skill sets to be the person they need to be in those very intense moments. So, I mean, that's awesome. This was a great show for me to listen to.
Yeah, well, especially you. Where could people find you if they want to learn more about your work?
Through alumni who've been through the program.
Okay. So you need an invitation to even follow this guy.
Right. So,
in essence, yes.
That's amazing. Well, listen, we're honored that you came on our show. I mean, this is like an inside individual that like lives in a world that we'll never know. So thank you for saying yes to coming on and teaching people that, we're very complex human beings, animals, that is.
Sure.
And man, we've got it good, people. So if you tend to stress out a lot, realize there's people that have stress levels that you'll never, ever, ever know. And if it's not life or death, your situation, that's why you're tuning into the Fit Because show, because you want to better yourself and you want to take your life to the next level. So Torin, again, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course. And for those of you listening, you gotta tune in next episode 26. We got Dr. Jeffrey Lake from Cenegenics Medical Institute, who's going to talk about aging well. He's going to debunk a lot of myths out there because there's too much information on the internet and a lot of it is garbage. So tune in for Dr. Lake. And if you guys have any suggestions for shows, please visit our website, fitbecause.com, and let us know what you want to hear. So thank you, George.
Thank you, Jen. Awesome. No, it was a really fun show. And thank you, Torin, again.
This has been Fit Because, hosted by Jennifer Zerling
and George Veater. Be sure to follow us on social media at Fit Because Show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
And for past episodes, be sure to visit our website at fitbecause.com.
Also, please subscribe to our show on iTunes and be sure to rate and comment. You may always request topics for our subsequent episodes.
And if you love this episode, please share it with someone you love so that we can continue spreading our mission to help people be fit.
Until next time, take care of yourself and know that your future is
Fit Because.